Hi, and welcome to Chapter 15. So Chapter 15 deals with monopolies. It's quite a different creature than the perfectly competitive firms that we had talked about before. So a monopoly comes from the Greek mono, one, poly, seller. Okay, it's the only seller in a market. And there's nothing that's kind of similar that would make it have to compete with anyone else, okay? So we'll study monopoly, and then we'll contrast it. How is it different from the perfect competition we studied last chapter? All right, so here's the really important thing. Please remember this. The monopoly has market power. Remember we talked about this last chapter about the perfectly competitive firms? They couldn't change the price. A monopoly, though, has the ability to change the price. That's what market power means. All right, now why do they exist? Okay, we say barriers to entry. That means that other firms cannot enter the market. That's basically what it means. Monopoly, there's only one seller because for some reason no one else can enter the market. Here's 3 reasons. One is a single firm owns the key resource. So De Beers owns most of the world's diamond mines. Perhaps maybe a large oil company owns a lot of oil fields in an area. They're the only people who have oil. Okay. Number 2, the government gives a single firm the exclusive right to produce the good. We call these patents, all right, or copyright laws. And they do these for various reasons. And then the third reason is called a natural monopoly. And it's just because whatever type of good that they're producing, if you just produce a lot of it, then it's much cheaper than if we had a bunch of firms producing a little tiny bit each. Okay, so let's imagine you have electricity. Okay, and if you just have one home, you still need a giant power plant, and so the cost for just even one quantity is very, very, very high because you have to pay for the power plant. But then let's say you produce a bunch more quantity or even a bunch more quantity, the average total cost is sloping downwards because I get to spread out the cost of the giant factory amongst a whole lot more people. And the power plant is really the only cost. It doesn't actually cost that much extra to add another person onto the electrical grid, so there's no real variable cost. It's just a huge fixed cost. Okay. So basically what we want is we want a monopoly in this case because we want we want one firm to produce all of the however much quantity we have in the market. We have a lower average total cost if we have higher quantities in each firm from just one firm making a bunch of quantity. Okay, so here we go. If there was 2 firms each producing 500, then the cost to me and you of our electrical bill would be $80. We actually want a monopoly in this case. Okay, so let's compare this monopoly to perfect competition right now. Demand curves. Remember, in any market, the market demand curve slopes downwards, but in the perfectly competitive marketplace, so we talked about this last chapter, the individual firm thinks or sees a demand curve that's flat. Why is that? Because he's a price taker. No matter how much quantity he makes, he can make this much quantity, or he can make this much quantity, or even way up here. The price doesn't change, remember? Because he's just a small little guy. So it looks flat for him. You can increase Q, and P doesn't change, so therefore marginal revenue equals price for the competitive firm. Remember, this is only for competitive firm. This is not going to be true for monopoly that we're going to talk about right now. Okay. However, in the monopolist, he just goes ahead and sells to the whole marketplace. He's the only seller in the whole market, so whatever the market conditions are, that's what he sells. It's a downward sloping demand curve. So if he wants to sell more Q, then he has to lower his price. So here's his Q, but if he wants to sell more Q over here, perhaps here, he's going to have to lower his price, right? You see that? So marginal revenue is not equal to P for a monopolist. Okay, as I sell a little bit more, the amount of revenue that I get is actually decreasing because my price is decreasing as well. So let's fill out a table. Here's some prices and quantities. This is basically, I just took that market demand and line, and I just put them down here in columns. And what I want you to do is fill out the rest of these columns. Okay, so total revenue is pretty easy. You just go Q times P. That's the total amount that this monopolist gets. Remember, again, that's not profits yet. This is just total amount of money that the firm is getting. It's just P times Q. The average revenue is just you divide it through by Q, and so price is always equal to average revenue, just like for a competitive firm. Okay, on average, how much is this product worth? Well, it's just worth whatever the price is. Okay, but marginal revenue, look at this. This is different. This is very different. If I look at how the revenue changes, it changes. It goes up $4, then it only goes up $3, then it only goes up $2, and that's what my marginal revenue here is. Remember, marginals are always written halfway between the quantities that they refer to, because it's the change from going from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2. Okay, so this is very weird. Let's go ahead and grab these. This is from the previous slide, and let's graph that. So the demand curve, I just graph it, right, as Q equals 0, then I graph at 450. As Q equals 1, then I graph at $4, etc. And now let's graph the marginal revenue curve. Look at this. It's actually hanging down under the demand curve. So this is interesting. The marginal revenue curve is always under the demand curve, no matter what kind of market conditions you have. The marginal revenue curve is always under the demand curve. All right. So why is this under there? Well, it's because when you have a higher Q, you have two things going on, right? Well, you're selling more stuff, so that raises the revenue, but remember, the price is falling as you're selling more, so that actually reduces revenue. So the monopolist must reduce the price on all the units it sells to sell a larger Q. It's not like I can sell the first one for $100 and then the second one for $95 and the third one for $90. I have to sell whatever quantity I choose. I have to sell all of those units for that price. Okay? So marginal revenue is always going down faster than P because the price is dropping. All right? And if the price effect exceeds the output effect, and go back a couple of slides, and you'll see that actually the marginal revenue is negative. So for profit max, so we just talked about revenues, but for profit max, we want to produce always, always, always at this point. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Please remember that. It's going to show up over and over again. So we need marginal revenue equal marginal cost. So then once it finds the quantity, then it sets the highest price possible. Okay, marginal revenue equals marginal cost is going to give you a Q, and then they're just going to sell that Q for as much money as they possibly can. And how much will it find it? How much will it be able to sell it for? From the demand curve. All right, so here we go. I have a marginal revenue and marginal cost curve as well as the demand curve. So this looks different from the perfectly competitive firm, because the demand curve is downward sloping, and now we also have this marginal revenue curve. All right, so we want to find the Q where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's pretty easy. That's this Q right here. But I want to caution you against some people accidentally go over here and they're like, oh, this is the right P. But why would it sell for this P? We know the demand curve actually we could sell for up to this much. Remember, this is what the demand curve is going to tell us. This is that at any point, this guy right here, guy number, I don't know, maybe this is guy number 100, he's willing to sell that much price, okay? Or, excuse me, he's willing to buy it for that price. That's what the demand curve is telling us. All right, so I just go ahead and slide on up and get a price, and that is the monopoly price and quantity. So profit, well, we're going to have to throw in an average total cost curve here. The average total cost curve doesn't have to be under the demand curve. If the average total cost curve was, let's say, up here perhaps, then the monopoly would actually make a loss. This would be a loss, this area right here. But let's just, to make it easier, suppose that the average total cost curve is down below, and price minus average total cost is how much the monopolist is making on each unit times Q units. That's the total profit. Okay, a monopolist does not have a supply curve. A competitive firm, right, does have a supply curve, because as the price that it's just given changes, it says, okay, the price is $10. Oh, okay, I can make this much. The price went up to 12. Oh, I can make this much. That's not how a monopolist works, right? A monopolist says, look, I'm going to make this much, and I'm going to charge this much price. Okay, so Q does not depend on P. They're determined by the intersection of the marginal revenue and marginal cost curves. So a monopoly firm does not have a supply curve. All right, so real quick, let's just look at monopoly versus generic drugs. We're going to imagine a monopoly has got some patent for a drug, but the generic drug is going to look like a perfectly competitive firm. Anyone can come in and sell it. So if it's a monopoly, then we know we're going to produce at this point price and quantity. This is because this is where the marginal cost and marginal revenue curves intersect right here. Notice for simplicity, we just have a flat marginal cost curve. We could have had an upward sloping marginal cost curve, but it's just not necessary. And some firms might have a flat marginal cost curve. Okay, when the patent expires then, so here's the outcome under the monopoly. But then let's turn it into a perfectly competitive firm. What does a perfectly competitive firm do? It sets price equal to marginal cost, and price, we take it from the demand curve. So this is actually the perfectly competitive equilibrium right here. Okay, and so the price obviously comes down from the monopoly price. Oops. The price comes down from the monopoly price and is right here, and the quantity goes up from the monopoly quantity and is right there. And that's what we would expect when we open it up to competition. It gets cheaper and we produce more of them. So here's the question. What does total surplus look like in monopoly? Remember that in competitive market equilibrium, where price equals marginal cost, we love this because total surplus of consumer surplus and producer surplus is maximized. However, in the monopoly equilibrium, remember that the price is higher than the marginal cost. So it means that there are some buyers who are willing to pay P more than the perhaps the drug costs, marginal cost, and so really we should make that. But the monopolist says, no, I don't want to make this extra good in the market because it will flood the marketplace and I won't be able to get as much high price, which means my profit will not be as high either. So monopoly has this thing called a deadweight loss. It's basically people wanting the good who would pay for it if it was perfectly competitive but can't afford to pay the high monopoly price. And here's what it looks like. All right, so we have a marginal cost and a demand curve. In the competitive equilibrium, remember, we just set price equals marginal cost, which is that point right there. Of course, in the competitive equilibrium, we generally had a flat demand curve, right? But that's okay. We're just going to have a downward sloping demand curve because this is talking about for the whole entire market. Okay, so we have this competitive equilibrium. We have QC, but, and then, of course, total surplus is maximized. But in the monopoly equilibrium, they don't set marginal cost equal to price. They set the marginal cost equal to the marginal revenue. So I drew in a marginal revenue curve, and here's my monopoly equilibrium. Okay, it's much lower, and then my price is much higher than the perfectly competitive equilibrium. So there's this thing called a deadweight loss. Remember, if you think back to the consumer surplus chapter, in the marginal cost, let's go back a couple of slides actually. In the perfectly competitive equilibrium, the consumer surplus was this right here, right? That was that much, and then the producer surplus was this much right here, and then all the total surplus that could be gotten was gotten. But under this monopoly outcome, we have a much smaller consumer surplus right here. Okay, we have a much bigger producer surplus here, right? So they capture all of this stuff. Okay, but then there's this little triangle that's not captured by anybody, and this is called deadweight loss. This is the happiness that people would have from purchasing the good, who want to purchase the good at the low, perfectly competitive price, but can't afford the high monopoly price. Okay, so that's a bit of a problem, and why we maybe don't like monopolists as much. Okay, the monopolist could engage in this thing called price discrimination. Now, what is that? Discrimination just means treating people differently. Normally, it's a bad thing. Price discrimination, I don't know. It might be. You might think of it as a bad thing, but it's different than regular discrimination. It just means being able to charge different prices to different buyers. Now, this makes sense because people have different willingness to pay. Remember back when we talked about willingness to pay. So if someone's willing to pay more, I should charge them more if I can figure it out. So let's look at this. Here's the regular monopoly outcome. It sells everything. It sells QM, and it sells all of those for PM. But what if I could, here we have the same price to all buyers, and I have this consumer surplus and that monopoly profit and this deadweight loss. But what if I could sell perfectly price discriminating? So it means somehow I could tell how much somebody wants to pay for it. So this guy here, number one, okay, I know he's willing to pay this much right here because it's on his demand curve. This guy right here, I know he's willing to pay maximum right here, right? This guy will buy anything as long as it's lower than this, but he won't buy it if it's higher than this. So I should charge him as much as I possibly can. I'm going to extract as much possible profit from this guy as possible. And essentially, I just charge each person their willingness to pay. Okay, this is called perfect price discrimination. And so therefore, all the consumer surplus is captured as profit. Now, I mean, it has the benefit of not having any deadweight loss. Okay, it has the negative of making the monopolist very, very rich. But you do notice that under the monopolist output, there was this deadweight loss here. Remember, these were people who wanted to buy the good but couldn't afford the high monopoly price. This was the high monopoly price. But here the monopolist is kind of, actually works out for these people because the monopolist is saying, okay, I see you can't afford it. I see you can't afford it. I see you can't afford it. I'm going to lower the price for you guys. These guys I'm going to charge through the roof, but these guys I'm going to charge not quite as much. Okay? So there's no deadweight loss. In the real world, it's not really possible to do this. There's no way to figure out exactly how much everyone's willing to pay. Buyers sure as heck don't tell it to people. And so what they do is firms, monopolists, divide people into groups and that they think that, okay, this older group might be willing to pay more, this younger group might not be willing to pay as much, and they can charge them different prices. Here's some examples, right? Movie tickets, senior students and matinees are lower. The price for movie tickets is lower because there's lower willingness to pay. But the people who come on a Friday night, they get charged through the roof because they know that their willingness to pay is very high. Okay, airline prices is they think there's two groups. There's business travelers who will pay a lot, and leisure travelers who won't pay as much. So that if you have a Saturday night stay over, they think that you're probably not a business traveler, so they charge you less for a ticket. That's very interesting in case you want to know how to get cheaper price tickets. All right, coupons like you find in the newspaper, right? People who are willing to clip their coupons, they probably have a lower willingness to pay because they have a lower income, so they get to pay cheaper. And finally, need-based financial aid. It divides people into groups depending on what they think their willingness to pay is. All right. Oh, and also quantity discounts. Sometimes if you buy, more large quantities of something, they'll charge you less. So firms charge less per unit. There's an example. Okay, so what should the government do towards monopolies? First of all, a lot of times people want to break up the monopolies and ban some anti-competitive practices. The government can break them up, and it can turn the market a little bit into a perfectly competitive market. Now remember, the reason why we want this perfectly competitive market is because we don't have a deadweight loss. It maximizes surplus. And so there's been historically laws that allow the government to break up monopolies. The other way to deal with monopolists is just not let them charge as much as they want to, right? So but the problem is with a natural monopoly, this won't work. Sometimes people think, hey, some government agencies think we should set price equals to marginal cost because that's what the perfectly competitive firms do. But you see that for natural monopolies, the price would be too low because if price was down here at marginal cost is down below average total cost, so the firm is always running a loss. Okay, so maybe they set price equal to average total cost, for example, to fix that problem, something like that. All right, another way to do it is public ownership. The U.S. Postal Service is an example, but it's a big problem, and we've seen the U.S. Postal Service. There's no profit motive because any profits that the Postal Service would make go right directly to the government. So the people who run the Postal Service are running very inefficiently, and it's putting on the brink of bankruptcy all the time. And then finally, there's nothing. Because everything has a problem, so maybe the best policy is no policy. All right, the conclusion. Pure monopolies are rare, yet many firms do have market power due to these barriers to entry, and maybe they sell a unique type of product. Maybe they're just big, they have a large market share, and we can think of these as monopolists as well. So we have, price being higher than marginal cost, and we have a deadweight loss. All right, thanks very much.